In this mini-series within the ICPA course, I want to talk to you more about New Zealand. As mentioned in other videos, I immigrated there in 1995, and New Zealand had put in a midwifery-led maternity system in 1990. I had come to New Zealand after 25 years working in this field and being asked by the hundreds of fathers and mothers that I worked with to carry forward the concept that we hope ICPA members will pass on to their clients, which is, you're pregnant, you're going to give birth, it is an activity, please learn some birth and birth coaching skills and use those skills in however your birth unfolds, because the birth of your baby is important to you. You can always use skills to do any activity, including giving birth, no matter the circumstances. And families also asked me to carry forward the Birthing Better skills. The first resource was the Pink Kit, and that was available in 2000. So I had already been in New Zealand for 5 years prior to technology catching up with our ability to create a mixed media resource. In my research about the history of New Zealand childbirth, I discovered 2 books. One was The Trouble with Women, which was the history of Parent Center, which is a consumer group. And I talk about that in the comparison of childbirth preparation video in this mini-series between the US and New Zealand. The other book I read was Women's Business, which was the history of New Zealand midwifery. And in that book, there was a slight referral to a study in which the footnote only said H.A. Brant National Women's, which is a hospital in Auckland. I called up the hospital, and turns out there are 28 libraries in the hospital. A librarian, after a 2-week search, found this article for me. It's 9 pages long. It's an article about the efficacy of the use of birth skills. It was conducted in 1961 in New Zealand, when the hundreds of families that I worked with in the early 70s in the United States, when there was a skills-based approach to childbirth via Lamaze and the Bradley Method, and where multiple millions of American families attended those skills-based classes, we knew back then that the philosophy, the ideas, and the words given from Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Digreed were focused on low-risk women to achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor without medical care. The families I worked with were high risk, so the concept that began to develop was to focus on 100% of pregnant women doing the activity rather than just one group. And the focus was on families coping and managing better during the activity rather than outcome-based, such as a natural birth or pain-free labor, or without medical care. In other words, we included all births and all families. So when I read this study, I thought, my goodness, this was already known in 1961. And I was curious as to why New Zealand midwives did not use this as a basis for wanting to grow a skilled birthing population within their partnership model. And that had to do with the shift that occurred globally in the late 1970s and the 80s, when the conversation around childbirth finally became a much larger conversation rather than country by country. The idea advocated by the new generation of natural birth advocates was that skills had not produced those 3 desired outcomes in a sufficient number of people. And this conclusion was reached independently both in New Zealand and in the United States. And therefore, the belief was that skills had no value and that what women really needed were choices. And I'll talk about this in another video, because the choices in the United States were more limited than the choices in New Zealand, because the United States did not have an integrated midwifery model. New Zealand did. By the 1980s, skills had been removed from childbirth classes. Information had replaced those skills. Reading this study from 1961 showed me that New Zealand could have led the way from that time into the midwifery model of care and into the partnership. But skills were dismissed by famous authors in the 1980s as not only unnecessary, but unessential, given words like cows and cats aren't taught to birth, women don't know how. Women birth instinctively, study. We've always given birth. We know how to birth. We just need to be left alone again. Now, when this study was conducted, fathers in New Zealand were not permitted into the hospitals. In the United States, fathers were just coming into the hospitals, and they were our birth coaches because Lamaze and Bradley focused on fathers as birth coaches. So I want to tell you a little bit about this study. The study was basically looking at birth skills, and it was conducted in the largest hospital in New Zealand. The skills that were shared in this study were based on Grantley Dick Reed. Lamaze didn't come into New Zealand until later. There was a group of 123 first-time moms and a control group of 66 first-time moms. It all started at 28 weeks of pregnancy, which is what fathers and mothers and I discovered, that you really wanted to start learning skills after 24 weeks because you know you're more than halfway through your pregnancy. You also want to take into account the potential of early births and the fact that women's heads become a little less clearer in the final weeks of pregnancy. So 24, 28 weeks gives you time to learn the skills. Participants were required to participate whether they liked it or not. Fathers were not permitted to be the birth coach. And so within the study, the women had an assigned birth coach that they didn't personally know. There are two groups, the treatment group and the control group. One was given Grantley Dick Reed's methods of relaxation and to reduce their emotional fear of birth, while the control group was not given that information. In the treatment group, in H.A. Brant studied, they were not risk evaluated in any form, either emotionally or physically. They were just first-time moms that came from all walks of life. Women who were difficult in the study in the treatment group were given extra attention. And all births, both in the control group and the treatment group, occurred over a 7-month period. The women in the treatment group were given 4 short 30-minute sessions, and there were discussions around fears and anxieties, and people were encouraged. Quote, "The aim was to be realistic and not to present a picture of the ideal easy birth, which rarely eventuates." And this is really important because the natural birth movement, as I explain in another video, interpret the word natural, normal, and physiological to basically mean it's a no-brainer. And the New Zealand midwifery model is based on that same interpretation. And I discuss that in this series in more depth. In this study, they did not use that belief system or those ideas. So they expressed the ideas that birth was going to unfold in unexpected ways. As said in the study, no attempt was made to depict labor as free of discomfort, but care was taken to reduce anxiety and to induce confidence. Another quote, "There was to be no sense of success or failure, and it would be in the patient's own interest to accept whatever course her particular labor should take." In the study, there was a belief that coaching was absolutely essential to help a woman to, quote, "cope with labor even when interventions occurred." It's an activity. 100% of us are going to do it, no matter how it unfolds. So we can use skills in our birth, regardless of what happens to and around us. To further quote the article, the woman was encouraged to accept the fact that she was pregnant and that labor was an inevitable outcome, and then to face up to it and contemplate it honestly. It's the language into the 1960s. She knew that she was going to have a birth coach, and she knew it wasn't going to be her husband. She was going to be assigned a birth coach who was going to guide her through the 4 30-minute sessions and be with her at her labor. Another quote from this study was, "She must maintain self-control, be patient, and be determined in carrying out the instructions she received." Now, when I talked to New Zealand midwives about this study, they rejected the study because of comments like that. They believe that women should not be told what to do, and it should be assumed that women know how to birth and are behaving in a way that is appropriate for them. Another aspect of this study was no formal anatomy or physiology was taught because they were of little practical value. And we heard this all the time once childbirth classes shifted from Lamaze and Bradley to information classes. We'd hear women say, "Everything I learned in the class went out the window when I went into labor." Whereas for my generation, who birthed birthed during the skills-based, when birth occurred, we doubled down on the use of our skills. Another quote in the study was, emphasis was placed on teaching the type of sensation and emotional reactions which would be experienced at various phases of labor. Physical, strengthening, and stretching exercises were admitted, as were pelvic floor exercises. Those were encouraged only in the postnatal period, but were not encouraged for birth, unlike in the United States, where Kegel exercises were encouraged as a way to prepare for birth. And as I talk in the Birthing Better Skills, what we discovered was this absolutely was one of the reasons births were being hindered. In these 4 30-minute sessions, women were taught relaxation and breathing skills, and they were encouraged to practice those skills. Another quote was that previous experience had shown that during labor, women frequently forgot what they had been taught, so that the birth coach's role was very significant by reminding, reassuring, and giving further instruction. And this is what I experienced when I gave birth first in 1970. Having my husband as a birth coach was remarkable, and that's what all Birthing Better families discovered. It was essential that we work together. By the 1980s, when I gave birth last, fathers had been actively reduced from the role of coach to only support people. And this has proven incredibly destructive to families, and we need to bring back fathers as coaches. And the woman was told that there was going to be no opportunity for a loss of self-control and composure, because the birth coach was going to really help her stay in control, manage, stay on top of, work through, and cope better. The control group just received routine care. In the assessment part of this 9-page study, midwives delivered all the babies, because midwives were fully integrated into New Zealand. So it's incredibly curious that in New Zealand, there was such a change that occurred in 1990. Midwives no longer were incorporated. They actually totally were in charge of the maternity system. So let me tell you more about the assessments. The average time spent in the hospital in labor was less for the treatment group, and there was notable absence of admission false labors in the treatment group. There was little difference in the length of labor, but this is an area that both Birthing Better Skills and the Webster technique actually deal with. The Webster technique is balancing the pelvis and balancing the nerves in the body. The Birthing Better Skills that fathers created were to create space in the pelvis and mobility in the bones of the pelvis and softness in the soft tissue, including a thorough preparation of the deep insides of the soft tissue of the birth canal. So we know that there can be a huge change in the length of labor when it is easier for a baby to move down through and out the pelvis effectively. To further on to the assessments in this study, second stage for the treatment women were shorter. There was a reduction of the use of forceps. In the treatment group, there were 8 posterior deliveries and 1 breech, unlike the control group. However, in both groups, there was a high episiotomy group, and we talk about that in the internal work with the Birthing Better Skills, which is very, very different than just doing perineal massage. The third stage was slightly shorter, with less manipulation in the treatment group. The blood loss was noticeably less in the treatment group. The use of pain relief in labor was much less in the treatment group. The use of pain relief in second stage was much less in the treatment group. And babies in the treatment group had much higher APGAR scores. When women were assessed physically, the treatment group had a 93% very good assessment compared to a 14-degree assessment of the control group. And all who observed the women in the treatment group were impressed by the calm, cooperative attitude. And the staff would often comment, "This is the way I want to have my baby." And this is what we experienced in the United States during the skills-based concept of the 60s through the mid-70s in the United States. The success of Lamaze was not recognized. We coped better, and staff and hospitals throughout the United States saw that and admired it and believed it would always continue that way. But it stopped abruptly because skills were no longer taught and instead women came in with birth plans and demands. There was a debriefing, and the women in the treatment group had not been adversely affected, and most were already looking forward to having their next baby. They were elated. While in the control group, women were often despondent, expressed a wish not to have further babies, and often dissolved into tears when discussing their labor. And this is an important factor. We knew from the Lamaze period in the United States that my generation, multiple millions of families, were empowered because we had skills and we worked together with birth and birth coaching skills. We knew by the 1980s that the huge rise of shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and the rise of trauma after birth occurred because women were not getting the birth that they wanted and they lacked skills, and fathers had been reduced to supporting them. So women didn't trust the men in their lives. We have to go back to having a skilled birthing population. And our belief is that ICPA members are one of the best profession to spread this and become the tipping point or 100th monkey. So there was a discussion about this study. Women with long labors in the treatment group coped far better and were alert in second stage and cooperative compared to the control group. What they also recognized, which is very interesting and something that we can talk about further, was that pain in second stage was often due to poor ability of softening and relaxing the pelvic floor. This is an important discussion about the internal work, which you'll find in another video. Further in the discussion, a prepared husband who is not a spectator would be beneficial to families. And this is why we want to bring back fathers as coaches. Further in discussion, babies from the treatment group had better physical condition following birth than those in the control group. And they also discovered what Birthing Better Families discovered, was that the benefit of self-learning was so essential to people actually learning the skills rather than in a group. But what they wanted to explain in this discussion was that the treatment group included everybody. They were all first-time moms. They were not risk evaluated for emotional, psychological, or physical risks. In other words, they showed in 1961 what we knew by the early 1970s, was that birth skills are for everyone and should be actively promoted. In the summary of the Brant study, the treatment group required less drugs. They spent less time in second stage, had lower incidences of operative delivery, a small postpartum blood loss, were calmer and more cooperative, and babies were in better physical condition as assessed by APGAR. This study was done in 1961. I can't tell you what it feels like for my 50 years in the early 70s to be making this class today. We need to wake up. Giving birth is an activity. It's it. It's infrequent, it's dramatic, it's dynamic, the memories last a lifetime, it's unpredictable, you cannot replay it. We must elevate a self-learning, skilled birthing population for all births and be encouraging this within families. Birthing Better Fathers were important to the development of all the skills, including the Pregnancy Academy, which has skills to use during the 5 phases of pregnancy from conception through birth, as well as preparing the body, and the birth and birth coaching skills to do the activity of birth. Why? Because as humans, we want to have continuity of skilled self. We're sick and tired of being skilled adults who fall into the black hole of pregnancy and birth and get shot out the other end into parenting, feeling like we didn't know what was happening. It's lovely when women have choices. But the reality is the majority of women around the world do not have choices. And the next reality is that most choices change. And the next reality is many women don't even pay attention to what they chose, or they didn't even like it as it unfolded. We need to couple choices with skills, and skills need to be the foundation of how every expectant family approaches birth. And how do we do that? We spread the idea. You're pregnant, learn some birth and birth coaching skills. And we give that simple words. And the actions are now, thankfully, lots of skills-based methods that people can choose from. And to start learning somewhere around 24, 26, 28 weeks, so that you've really integrated the skills into your life. And begin to use the skills early as you transition out of pregnancy into birth, whether that's driving to the hospital to get prepped and to have surgery, which you can use your breathing and relaxation skills, your touch and communication skills throughout that activity, or the earliest part of labor, or the niggling part where you're a little bit confused. The more you use skills in the early part, the more you will use skills as you need to work harder. Labor is called work. We need skills to do the work. So this is a 1961 study. Contemplate that and think about how you can change the childbirth message.